I'm going to talk about the long-term outcomes of bullying, and I'll just give you a little snapshot of what's going to happen. So first of all, I'm going to talk about mental health, which may seem like a bit of a detour, but it's going to become obvious why I'm doing this. I'm going to talk about how mental health problems are caused by bullying victimization. I'm going to describe the temporal priority. Is it the case that kids become unwell as a consequence of bullying, or the reverse? I'm going to talk about what the long-term outcomes, and then I'm going to specifically focus a little bit on social isolation and COVID-19 because it has implications for bullying. And then I'm going to talk about how we can improve children's lives worldwide. So when we think about mental health, we think about it existing along a continuum where we have a lot of children who are doing well, some who have mental, emotional problems and concerns, and then some who have a bona fide mental health disorder. What differentiates children along this line, children and youth along this line, is distress and or disability. So when we're talking about a mental disorder, children have pronounced distress and or disability. So they're not going to school, they're not going to the soccer practice, they have a hard time getting up in the morning, they're crying all the time, depending on the disorder, of course. So, but a lot of times we're looking along this line. So not necessarily all the way over here on mental illness, but kids who are about to come into that more difficult area. Children and youth do not code switch out of a mental disorder. It exists across a variety of contexts and it's entrenched. So children who have difficulties at school, but not at home or in other contexts, typically have an issue with that environment. And the reverse is also true. So if they have problems at home, but they're doing well at school, we think about this being a home environmental issue. So kids cannot code switch out of it. Now, it's not to say they can't fake well. Some can suffer in silence and seemingly manage well, but it's still there. In Canada, about 15 to 20% of children have serious mental health problems. So in fact, 1 in 5 Canadian children meet diagnostic criteria for a mental disorder. And over 20% of children report experiencing 2 or more psychological symptoms per week. I know this is a world series, so I'll put this in context in the world. So the scope of the problem worldwide is a little bit better, it seems. 13.4% of children worldwide meet diagnostic criteria for mental disorder. We know that adolescent mental health issues are becoming more common and they're a challenge across the world. So UNICEF puts out report cards every year, and they've been tracking children in economically advanced countries for many, many years. And here they're comparing the 2006 rates to the 2010 rates to the current rates of 2017. And I'll just look at Canada as one example. The reason everything's clustered together here is because nothing is improving. And you can see some countries are doing better than others, but for the most part, you see this clustering because we're not putting a dent on this issue. Suicide is the leading cause of death among youth in high-income countries. It accounts for almost 18% of all deaths. And it's a particular problem for boys. So you can look at the suicide rates for economically advanced countries using the UNICEF report card again. We know that there's enormous continuity. So adults who have mental health problems had mental health problems in childhood. So 50 to 75% of adult mental health disorders began before the age of 15. And I'll give you one example from a study that I did with my postdoc, Amanda Craigsman. So we looked at the symptoms of mental health issues. So in particular, social anxiety across childhood to adolescence. So grade 5 to grade 12. We use trajectory analyses. So we're going to compare this low trajectory where there's very few symptoms of social anxiety to the high symptom trajectory in the prediction of adult mental disorders. So these are diagnoses in adulthood. And what we found were that children who followed this high trajectory of social anxiety symptoms were 20 times more likely to be depressed in adulthood, 16 times more likely to have social anxiety disorder in adulthood, 16 times more likely to have agoraphobia, and 13 times more likely to meet diagnostic criteria for generalized anxiety disorder compared to that low trajectory. In adults, mental health problems are the leading cause of disability worldwide. So mental health issues have now surpassed cardiovascular issues like hypertension. They account for about 8 million deaths each year. So about 14.3% of adults die each year, and it's directly attributed to mental health problems. So how do we reduce this burden? So this is an enormous burden. It's the #1 health concern worldwide. How do we reduce it? So I've argued for the past 20 years of my career that we need to improve children's peer relationships. And the reason why we need to is because the evidence supports a causal relationship between mental health problems and bullying victimization. And we don't say this lightly. As you know, scientists cringe when they hear causal. They want to see an experimental design. But this more at all meta-analysis looks at the longitudinal profiles of kids who have been bullied in relation to mental health, and they come out with this statement. So what's the prevalence of bullying? So worldwide, about 1/3 of children bully others, about 1/3 of children get bullied, and about 10% of students worldwide are bullied on a daily basis. I was part of the expert panel for the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine, and we collated all of the data and put it into these prevalence statistics. And what we found was about 18 to 31% of children and youth are bullied in a traditional way. So face-to-face bullying, verbal, physical, social, and the like, and about 7 to 15% are cyberbullied. So can you imagine? So we have 1 in 5 children in Canada and about 1 in 7 worldwide who have mental health difficulties. We know that there's a causal relationship between mental health difficulties and bullying victimization. And we have about 1/3 of our population in the world, youth population, experiencing bullying. And we're doing very little to reduce this. Now, there's issues with this too. One of the reasons why we're really concerned about it is because studies are now showing that targets of bullying become perpetrators of bullying. We know that this continuity of aggression exists. So for example, in a study I just did with my other postdoc, who's now a professor at UVic, we found that bullying in pre-adolescence related to involvement in multiple forms of aggression in adulthood. So we could identify individuals in grade 5 who were bullying their peers, and they were more likely to engage in sexual harassment, homophobic taunting, and dating violence in adulthood. So although aggression changes as individuals develop, it's still toxic for the individuals who are in their lives. Patty McDougall and I collated the literature on the long-term outcomes of peer victimization in childhood and in adolescence, and we published this in 2015. And basically, bullying victimization affects virtually all aspects of an individual's functioning. Individuals who are bullied by their peers have more academic difficulties, school truancy and avoidance, increased absenteeism. They have more somatic complaints, more stress-related illness, more physical health problems. They have lower self-esteem. They're more depressed. They're more socially withdrawn and isolated. They're more socially anxious. They're more lonely. They're more suicidal, and they're more aggressive. And again, remember the developmental trajectory is from victim to perpetrator. So what we've noticed in our research, and what I've noticed clinically when I used to do clinical work, and a lot of my students still do clinical work, is that poorly treated youth either get mad or they get sad. And this happens in the immediate and in the long term. And the effects are enormous. So I'll just give you one example. So there was a recent school shooting that just happened in Michigan. And I'm not saying that the cause was bullying victimization. Obviously, this was a very challenging young man. He had a lot of issues. He came from a family that obviously had some issues as well. But it's interesting because early reports from his peers are saying that he was bullied. And we know from other school shootings that about 1/3 are attributed to bullying, so a retaliation of poor treatment. There were a few long-term studies looking at the impact of childhood bullying on adult outcomes, up to 40 and even 50 years after the fact. So in this study, they looked at being frequently bullied in childhood and its prediction of depression, anxiety, and suicidality in adulthood, and they found increased rates for those who were bullied in childhood. What's really interesting about this study is that they say that the effects were similar to those of being placed in public or substitute care and an index of multiple childhood adversities, meaning that the stressors of living in foster care, the stressors of living in poverty, and all of those other stressors, were related to anxiety, depression, suicidality in a similar way that childhood bullying was in adulthood. This is a terrific study where they compared two population cohorts. So they look at the Avon longitudinal study of parents and children in the UK, and then they also look at whether or not they can replicate this in the GSMS cohort in the United States. So what they did was they looked at child maltreatment, bullying victimization, and how that predicted adult mental health. So this is things that happen in childhood and how it relates to adult mental health. And I'll just give you one example from the GSMS study. So the Smoky Mountain study, the Great Smoky Mountain study. What they found was that, and here they're looking at overall mental health problems in adulthood predicted by maltreatment or bullying alone and the combination. And being bullied alone predicted greater impairment in adulthood than the combination of child maltreatment and bullying or child maltreatment alone. And keep in mind that this was replicated with two population-based studies. Other studies are coming out showing that victims of childhood bullying also report more externalizing issues. So in this one, they looked at the long-term consequences of childhood bullying on adult substance use. And they found that victims of childhood bullying were more likely to smoke cigarettes, to use marijuana, and to use non-marijuana drugs. This one breaks my heart. It really does. So in this study, they looked at the long-term economic impact associated with childhood bullying. And they looked at it at the individual and societal level across 4 decades after exposure. And what they found were that individuals who were bullied in childhood were less likely to be employed in midlife. And this not only impacted their midlife income, but it also impacted their accumulated wealth. They also found that for men, there were higher societal employment costs associated with childhood bullying, and that for women, they saw higher health service costs. So the challenging thing about this study, as we know, when we look at the impact of poverty on health and wellness and prosperity, is that it accumulates over time and it's passed down to generations. So these are the effects on the individual in red, which then we know is going to impact their children and their grandchildren and for future generations to come. So bullying is not only impacting the individual, it's impacting society and it's impacting future generations. So what is the temporal sequence? It's interesting because when I used to do clinical work, I often thought that kids became unwell as a consequence of being bullied because that's all I saw in the clinic. 95% of the kids that I saw, so children and adolescents, were bullied. My really good friend is a child psychiatrist, and she rarely sees kids in her practice who aren't bullied. So is it the case that poor treatment leads to poor mental health? Or is it the case that kids are already unwell to begin with, and this leads to poor peer treatment, which then exacerbates their mental health difficulties? So there's a lot of research to support that peer victimization leads to mental health difficulties. So the temporal sequence is from being bullied to having mental health issues. So the studies are below. Meta-analyses support this when we look at internalizing problems like depression and anxiety. And here's just one example it's a meta-analysis looking at the impact of victimization in childhood on depression up to 36 years later, and they did find a positive relation. And as I mentioned earlier, there's a new meta-analysis, fairly new, came out in 2017, looking at childhood bullying and mental health difficulties, and they conclude that there's strong evidence that exists for a causal relation between bullying victimization, mental health problems, and substance use. There's also evidence supporting that peer victimization predicts future problems with externalizing problems. And it tends to be, again, like that heterotypic continuity that I mentioned. So bullying leads to intimate partner violence in adulthood. Bullying others, so this is not victimization per se, leads to issues with child maltreatment. But being bullied also predicts externalizing issues like substance abuse and also becoming a bully. And again, I said that kids who get bullied, they either get mad or they get sad. But there's also evidence for a symptoms-driven model where poor mental health leads to poor peer treatment, which in turn leads to poor mental health or poorer mental health. So here's just one example that I did with Heather Britton, Patricia McDougall, and Eric Duku, where we looked at internalizing problems, where we found, that internalizing problems in grade 5 predicted bullying victimization in grade 6, which predicted more internalizing problems in grade 7, which then predicted more victimization in grade 8. And what's interesting, and we talk about this a lot in our lab, is about how depressed teenagers and kids are perceived by their peers. It doesn't engender a positive response from peers. And so it really puts them at risk. And the kicker is that at a time in their life when they're so vulnerable, they need people to be empathetic and kind to them, and yet they're being cruel to them. We've also replicated this all the way to grade 12. Amanda and myself have, where we found that there were symptoms-driven pathways from depression to peer rejection and peer victimization from grade 5 to grade 12. We've also shown symptoms-driven pathways with respect to eating disorder. We published this just recently with a former postdoc of mine, Kirsty Lee, in JAMA. And here we found that disordered eating led to greater peer victimization. So we do have some children and youth who are vulnerable and the peer group's just not kind to them. We've even demonstrated this in preschools and preschoolers. So Amanda and I have looked at peer victimization, aggression, and depressive symptoms in 3-year-olds, and we find links. This isn't a longitudinal study, but it's quite distressing to know that kids as young as 3 get picked on by their peers, and it causes them profound sadness. I've done the bulk of my work looking at how bullying gets under the skin to confer a risk. And I'm not going to go into great detail on this, but I do want to point out this neurobiological model. And what we find is that poor interpersonal relationships, including bullying victimization, leads to dysregulation of the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, so your stress response system. It's inherently stressful to be bullied. This in turn affects the glucocorticoid receptor sites in the prefrontal cortex and in the hippocampus. So we showed this, that it affects memory and learning, and it leads to learning impairment. So that was a study, we did a longitudinal study in 2011, which in turn also affects neurogenesis and leads to depression and anxiety. So we have a new paper out in Frontiers in Neuroscience if you're interested in it, and you can even contact me and I can link you up with it. All this to say is that children aren't doing well when they're bullied, and it has implications for their health in the future, and it has implications for how they're going to manage a stressor in the future. Okay, so why this pattern of impairment? So it's clear to me, and it's probably clear to anybody else who studies peer relations, that this impairment is linked to thwarting an individual's fundamental need to belong. So the need to belong is a fundamental human motivator. And when children and youth do not belong to the peer group, it causes them harm. And the reason being, again, is that this is something that is hardwired in us. It's a biologically based human drive. We know from studies on social deprivation from the past that social ties are not just a luxury, they're essential for optimal development. And the thing that really concerns me is that we already know this to be true, and yet what we're doing right now with school closures and like during COVID is that we are depriving individuals of their fundamental need to belong. So we now have this natural experiment undergo on social deprivation. We wrote a report for the Royal Society of Canada that I chaired, and it's something that you can download, and maybe Heather can throw it into the chat for everybody so they can easily download it, where we chronicle the impact of COVID-19 on children in the context of schools. And it's not just a report that deals with Canadian children, it's a report that deals with world children or children of the world. We know from the UNESCO COVID-19 global monitoring of school closures that at the beginning of the pandemic, over 90% of the world's 1.6 billion students were impacted by school closures. And we know that as of the summer, half of the students are still affected by partial or full school closures. We know that before the pandemic, that loneliness increased the risk of poor physical health, poor mental health, and lower academic achievement. Kids who are bullied are lonely. So right now, what I'm showing you is this isn't even a fact of being bullied, where you're actively persecuted and humiliated and oppressed by your peers. This is where we just isolate kids from their peers and they're not doing well. During COVID, we have seen loneliness increase. So we should expect loneliness to increase in children who are bullied. Again, it's a naturalistic experiment or a natural experiment. So as one example, Belgian teens, loneliness had a greater negative impact on their happiness than feelings of anxiety. So loneliness trumped anxiety. In another study of British teens, loneliness was associated with symptoms of mental health problems, which were more pronounced in children who had, or teens who had poor relationships with their parents. And another example from Germany, this is of children who were aged 9 to 18. Their perceptions of social support were lower during the pandemic than before, which we would expect, and this impacted their sense of well-being. So if we can understand that this is happening when we just isolate them from their peers, again, what if you add the torture of the torture that children who are bullied endure? So we now know that the evidence is accumulating that school closures, isolating kids from their peers, taking them away from their soccer practices and the like, has a negative impact on social, emotional, and academic development. And we know from past literatures and from the current literature that's evolving that social isolation is particularly problematic for mental health. But there's one interesting thing that's happening. So I said that bullying causes mental health difficulties and we need to reduce bullying. So we did an experimental study where we looked at COVID before the pandemic and during the pandemic, and this was independent of school closures. So they were at school. And we found reductions that we had never seen in my lifetime since I've been studying this. So I've never seen such reductions in bullying despite everything we've done. And it's interesting because I was just giving a talk in Finland and Christina Salmavalli's group mentioned that they had also found in their longitudinal study lower rates of bullying than they've ever seen. And keep in mind that they have that really amazing and impressive Kiva intervention program in their country. There was also a study that's going to be coming out soon. It's just under review from Italy showing this. One of the things I've said forever is that if we want to reduce bullying, we need to increase supervision. And in this study, what I think happened is that when we were supervising children and teens, supervising them to make sure they had their mask on right, that they were washing their hands, that they were socially distancing within the school and the like, that we were also observing their peer interactions to great effect on bullying rates. Okay, so we have a notable problem. We have a mental health problem, a crisis that predates the pandemic and is worse during the pandemic. We also have an issue with bullying in that bullying causes, to a large extent, this mental health crisis. So how can we fix it? Here's just a couple of examples. If we want to improve children's mental health and youth mental health, we need to always focus on their fundamental need to belong. We also need to, in particular, pay attention to their peer relationships. They're important to them. And we need to reduce bullying. If we reduce bullying, we will improve children's mental health. Again, because there's a causal relationship between poor mental health and bullying victimization. We also need to prioritize social emotional learning and development because the research is really strong in this area. Social emotional learning programs are reduce bullying perpetration and victimization. And we also know that bullying perpetration and victimization has a strong link to social emotional competencies. So if we can improve competencies in this area, then we can improve our bullying rates or decrease our bullying rates. So this is one really promising area. We also need children and youth to feel that they matter. And this comes into that social emotional framework, especially now when they're facing many unprecedented and prolonged stressors. I think we're going to be into year 3 before we're out of this pandemic. They need to matter now more than ever. And it's really interesting because we came to this conclusion in our report for the Royal Society of Canada, and the American counterpart, which is the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine, put out their report, and they said the exact same thing. They also said that we need to prioritize on social emotional learning, which is what we also said, independent of them. So we read very similar literature. We know from other studies and from past what has worked to improve mental health and to improve peer relations. And this is what we said should be done. And I'll give you one example on mattering. So we did a study where we looked at mattering as a function of how they were being educated during the pandemic. So this has nothing to do with school closures. They're not, the schools are not closed in this study. So in Ontario, children had, parents had a choice of not sending their kids to school if they were worried about the pandemic. So we had children in elementary school who attended school every day face-to-face. So face-to-face learning. So they learned with their peers and face-to-face with their teacher. We had also elementary school students who learned only virtually. So they were online the whole time. We had high school students who had a blended learning program. So they would either learn virtually on the days they weren't in school and obviously face-to-face when they were in school. And then we also had high school students, secondary students who only learned online. We accounted for the fact that you were probably more likely to go on to the online learning if you were bullied and you felt like it didn't matter. So that's corrected for in the study. And what we found was that face-to-face learning is what mattered for mattering. And this is really important because I'm really arguing to everybody around the world who's listening to this that we can't isolate kids from their peers. We also know from the literature that caring and high expectations are really important for kids who are bullied and also for their mental health. So high structure with no support doesn't lead to great child outcomes. Just support with no structure does not lead to good child outcomes. What you want is to have high expectations with appropriate support, and that's what leads to the best child outcomes. So that's where we're at. I just want to highlight that we're going to have a really amazing talk for the next one on the neuromechanisms of aggression, and we hope you join us. And now we'll just take questions. So we'll get Dominic to moderate this discussion moving forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Tracy. I'm giving you real applause.
Thank you.
You can also do the virtual